and I will let everybody.
Oh, can anyone hear me? I lost everybody. Okay, Linda, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can
hear you.
All right, my sound is not fully stable, I've realized, so I just have to check on and off. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the District 15 post-legislative session for 2023 Town Hall. We've got our esteemed delegation, Brian Feldman, Senator Brian Feldman, Delegate Lily Chi, Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo, and Delegate Linda Foley on here with us. We were here before session started in January, and we're happy to have our colleagues back in the district with us. And we're very excited to hear about their achievements, the major legislations. And, this has really been a hallmark year because we've had a Democratic governor and really Democrats statewide occupying all of the positions, Attorney General as well as Comptroller. So there's been a tremendous amount of energy that was present from day one. And I believe that you could tell that the Moore Miller administration really hit the ground running to really support our delegation and the General Assembly to pass key items. And so I apologize. My name is Saman Kadir Ahmed. I'm the chair of the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee, as well as the representative from District 15. And before we get started, I also want to recognize a few colleagues that are here today. And feel free to put your name in the chat. I know that we've got the District 15 caucus leadership, which is Gail Cheek, our caucus chair, Kathy Dierkowski, Ginger McComber, and Larry Arch on tonight. We also have MCDCC members Andrew Sondry, as well as I believe Nathan Feldman on tonight. And if we have any county council members, my apologies if I didn't call on you, but feel free to drop a message. And we've also got Marco Rivera Oven from, I think I mentioned his name, but we've got Marco on from D15 as well. He's one of our at-large members. So feel free to put it in the chat and I'll give you guys a shout out. Before we begin, many of the questions that were submitted by members of the community, which I'll be able to go through as I'm moderating the panel tonight, I wanted to yield some time to our members of our delegation, beginning with Senator Feldman, to give some opening remarks, just about a recap of how this session went, any major wins, any specific bills that you worked on, what your experience on a new committee was like. I know you've had, there have been a lot of committee movement for our members this time around. And so as Senator Feldman always likes, he gets 8 minutes for his opening remarks. And we'll do 5 minutes for the delegates. So Brian, please.
Okay, well, first, let me thank MCDCC again for putting this together, and you, Saman, for agreeing to be the moderator. And so I'm going to start maybe where you left off, where the political landscape, I mean, if you think about it, and I made this point pre-session, I'm going to reiterate, when we think about where we were 4 years ago, 2019 session, and where we are today, it's really pretty dramatic. And just to kind of refresh everybody's memory on every level, we began 2019 session, we had different presiding officers. We had a different Senate president. At that time it was Mike Miller. We had a Speaker of the House, Mike Bush. Now we've got Bill Ferguson, Adrian Jones. We've got a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, a new comptroller, a new state treasurer. We've got different chairs, and we even have a different District 15 team with the addition of obviously Delegate Linda Foley taking the spot vacated by now Judge Dumais. So things have shifted dramatically in a short period of time, and I'm sure 4 years from now, when we're looking back, things are going to probably look a lot different again. But just if I might say a few things about my teammates here, I have to just kind of give a shout out. I mean, when you look at where we've been and where we're at right now, let me start with our senior delegate at this point, hard to believe, but Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, again, has really established himself in the General Assembly in a major way when it comes to electric vehicle infrastructure, energy storage, environmental issues. And he moved to a different committee, the House Economic Matters Committee, to join Delegate Chi. So a lot of the issues that I deal with in my committee, which I'll mention in a minute, go through the House Economic Matters Committee. So having two of my teammates on that committee turned out to be fantastic this session. And Linda Foley serves on another committee that I share jurisdiction with, the Environment and Transportation Committee, which itself is going to go through some changes in terms of chairmanships and the like. So Dave has been a point guy on constituent issues, White's Ferry. I know there are some questions on that front. And he can talk about some of the legislation that he got passed that came out of House through my committee and the like. And then Lily, similarly, now entering her second term, Lily Chi, also found her voice. She's chairing a subcommittee now in the House Economic Matters Committee, the Business Regulation Subcommittee. She has been very involved in economic development issues previous to the session, but now she's siphoned off and broadened her horizons with bills on cybersecurity and other issues. And again, a lot of those issues ended up through my committee on the Senate side. And then finally, Linda found her voice on the Environment and Transportation Committee, got some bills passed, following in the footsteps of Kathleen Dumais, Aruna Miller. I think she's found her groove, and she's been an instrumental partner in terms of us securing yet again a massive haul back for District 15 capital projects. And so, they'll talk about some of the individual things that they worked on. Also, big picture, I just want to throw out just the fact that we again balanced our budget, but with a new governor, there was not a lot of acrimony with Governor Moore and the Moore-Miller administration. We achieved that without raising any new taxes, a $63 billion state budget. We did it and put money away into a rainy day fund because there's some concern about a downturn in the economy moving forward, potentially a recession. So we put $2.5 billion into a rainy day fund. We have a surplus coming into the session. I think that was smart. We were able to put money towards the Kerwin blueprint for Maryland, about a $900 million down payment towards that massive investment in K through 12 education. And we ended up with, again, a AAA bond rating, one of only 13 states in the United States that can say that all three bond rating agencies gave our state a AAA bond rating. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that. Bottom line, also for Montgomery County, we had an 8% increase in direct aid to Montgomery County over last year. Even though we were in a little bit of a downturn, we managed as a delegation to get over 8% more money than a year ago in direct state aid. We had about 3,000 bills, and ranging from abortion, guns, and a lot of issues, which we'll get to maybe the Q&A. The most important part of these sessions is the Q&A. But let me just focus really briefly on some things I was directly involved with, and then I'll turn to my teammates. Then we'll, again, open it up for some Q&A. So as was alluded to earlier, I'm chairing a brand new committee in the Senate called the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee, EEE. And we have a lot of new members, a new jurisdiction. The last 4 years, in the prior term, I was the vice chair of the Senate Finance Committee. So this was, for me, a different endeavor, an exciting endeavor, but also a lot of new topics. A lot of committee members I've never been on a committee with before, and so it was exciting. But let me just, and the jurisdiction's not just education, energy, and the environment. It includes election law, it includes affordable housing. It's got very, very broad jurisdiction. And so let me just start on energy policy. 4 years ago, I was the sponsor of the Clean Energy Jobs Act of Maryland. And so since then, I've been sort of the point guy in the Senate on energy policy. And this year, and I'd also say the Inflation Reduction Act has resulted in about $370 billion flowing to the states in terms of clean energy projects and the like. And it's the states that can put together policies on the ground, I think, that are going to be the states that are going to be the big beneficiaries of the next 5-10 years when it comes to clean energy. And clean energy ties in very nicely with the environment and the like. And so I spent a lot of time on that. We passed a massive piece of legislation dealing with offshore wind. We passed legislation on energy storage, electric vehicles, electric vehicle infrastructure. Delegate Fraser Hidalgo was in the middle of all those bills. He can talk about that. We talked, and I'll leave there, on electric vehicles. We're moving big. We're adopting the California models on vehicle in terms of vehicle emission standards. So we're going to go much, much bigger over the next 10 years. In that space. And I think this was a significant session for that. And I can talk about some of the particulars. We had a package of reproductive health care bills. One of them came through my committee, which I sponsored, which is going to deal with, on our college campuses, All the college campuses under the University of Maryland system are going to have reproductive health care plans in place starting next year that will provide networks and services for folks who need those reproductive health services. We have nothing like that currently. That's, I think, a major piece of legislation. It was part of a package of 4 bills dealing with abortion rights post Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. And I can walk you through later the 3 other bills beyond the bill that I collaborated with Delegate Ariana Kelly at the time, now Senator Ariana Kelly. And then we dealt with a whole bunch of education bills. Specifically, we passed legislation, the governor's bill on the Educator Shortage Act, which deals with recruitment and retention of teachers. That came through my committee. We dealt with virtual learning, which is a big topic. We put in place requirements that have not existed previously for virtual education. We dealt with some special ed issues. I know there's some questions on the table there. I look forward to giving folks sort of a more full panoply of kind of what we dealt with, some of the issues that we ran through, and that's on education. Individual, beyond my own committee, I was the lead sponsor in Maryland of the cannabis legalization bill. I know there's some questions in the queue on that. And then also I dealt with healthcare. Even though I'm no longer on a committee that deals with healthcare policy, it's still something I'm very involved with. And so I had a couple of bills dealing with prescription drug affordability that passed the legislature that actually was signed by Governor Moore last week, and also made a pilot program, extended something dealing with young adults and low income and state subsidies for kids 18 to 34, young adults, to help them purchase health insurance. We've been very innovative in the health insurance space over the past 4 or 5 years. We've cut our rate of uninsured in half. This is a pretty significant piece of legislation that I sponsored that we got passed. That'll actually be signed by Governor Moore in about 2 weeks' time. And I mentioned prescription drugs. And again, miscellaneous things. Again, we had a package of bills dealing with abortion, reproductive health care, guns. We dealt with the 529 debacle, which we can talk in, that started in my committee, ended up passing, and minimum wage. We did some things on minimum wage that came out of the House Economic Matters Committee. Maybe Lily or Dave can talk about that. So why don't I stop there, Simon? I threw a bunch out there. We had literally 3,000 bills this session. 450 of them were in my committee that I chair. 5 minutes or 8 minutes is really not a lot of time, but I'll stop there because I do look forward, as always, to the Q&A portion of these town halls. So with that, I'll yield back to you, and you can pick the next speaker, okay?
Thank you, Brian. And we will definitely actually loop back in, actually beginning with you on some of the key questions related to some of the bills that you talked about. So I want to yield to Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Simon, thank you for having us. Again, thank you to the Central Committee and to the District 15 caucus for putting everything together so we can be here again. I appreciate it. So as Senator Feldman mentioned, this is my first year on economic matters. I spent 9 years on environment and transportation. So dealing with a lot of environmental and transportation subject matter, but where I really wanted to work next is in climate change specifically, not just in the environment, but I really wanted to drill down and go into climate change and business related issues. And that, of course, is in economic matters. So after serving for 9 years on ENT and chairing that transportation subcommittee, I went over to economic matters. So on economic matters, I chair the property and casualty insurance subcommittee, and which we got a few bills on, not a lot. And then I kind of concentrated a lot of my efforts on climate change, which I was doing at ENT, but it's kind of hard to be in one committee and concentrate some of your efforts in a committee with a completely different jurisdiction. It's kind of hard. It's a lot easier to be inside that committee. So as far as some bills that I worked on, one of the bills that I think Senator Feldman was alluding to that he was very, very helpful on was a storage bill. It was how do you store electricity, right? So one of the big things in climate change that I think is important for people to understand is it's not just about generating electricity, because everybody wants to generate electricity and people think, oh, we can use solar, we can use wind, which is great. That's what we want to do. The problem is at night, you're not generating any electricity. And when the wind doesn't blow, you're not generating any electricity. So we have to be able to store electricity to use it when we want. And as some of you may remember, last year, I worked really hard on a bus bill that transitioned our school bus fleet to electric school buses. And then in the summer, we could use those big batteries on those electric school buses to help run people's homes, on cloudy days or when there's not a lot of renewables available or at night. So in this session, one of the things that I concentrated on is the state coming up with a new policy or goal, which is 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2033, which is a very, very large number. And it's fairly agnostic on what that storage is, but essentially it says we need to be able to store electricity in a green way through things like batteries and thermal and water, whatever we can do to store electricity so we can use it when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. This is incredibly important. So that bill passed. It was a very, very heavy lift. I did not think it was going to be as heavy lift as it was, but it got out late in the House. And then we dropped it over very squarely into EEE to Senator Feldman. And then I begged Senator Feldman to do everything he could to get it out. And a couple of days before Sani Dai, after a lot of work on his part, he popped it on out with some amendments on it, and we got it across. And so that was a really big lift for me. Also on car charging, anybody who drives an EV can remember the HOV sticker, so you can drive your EV in the HOV lane. That expired last year. We renewed that. So if you've got an EV, I see you nodding and smiling.
It didn't arrive. I was like, where is it?
No, the bill passed. So you will have to pay $20 now. That's for the sticker, but it extends the program for 2.5 more years. So it'll allow you to drive in the HOV lanes all by yourself in an EV. So not a huge bill, but it affects a good number of people. There are about 65,000 registered EVs in Maryland right now. So that's a big benefit, right? So there was also some charging reliability that I put in to make sure that those third-party chargers that are run by the utilities like Pepco and BG&E actually stay up and running, because we've had a lot of complaints both on private party chargers and public chargers about them not always being up and running. So there'll be another bill on that next year to kind of go after private industry to try and get their uptimes up, because it would be people would be very upset if they pulled up to a gas station and every other gas station they pulled up to was out of fuel. And that's essentially what's been happening in some of the EVs. So we're trying to get that all squared away. It's young, it's new. So those are kind of some of the big things. There's also, told you about the charging, rebates. We worked on some of that directly with the governor. Those are kind of the really big bills. Some other big wins. We had an air quality monitoring bill that requires the Maryland Department of the Environment to put up air quality monitoring systems so that we can check what it's like on bad pollution days in various neighborhoods, particularly those neighborhoods that are socioeconomically challenged, to make sure that we're making sure that our kids aren't going to the emergency room with asthma and other related issues. We ended up not fully passing that bill. What we did is put money into the budget. This was very creative. We put money into the budget for the bill and said that MDE could do it themselves, but they can't get the money unless they do it. So that was a very creative way around that bill, which I was pretty excited about. And then there's a whole slurry of other bills, but I'm sure I'm pretty close to my 5 minutes, right, Saman? So am I getting close? Okay, so I will kick it to the next speaker, and then I saw some of the questions. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. A lot of bond initiatives, that kind of thing. And we'll talk
All
about.
right. So we're next with Delegate T.
Should have remembered to unmute myself to get ready. Thank you, Sama, and thank you all the organizers of D15 caucus, the most active caucus, right? It went so fast. It was really a whirlwind, but I think this was the first time I felt like I enjoyed the most in every dimension of legislative life, because it was fully open post-pandemic kind of mode, where it was hybrid, super accessible for the public to participate, whether in person or virtual. And also because we have a new governor whom we are not fearful of vetoing our important bills. And that gave us huge peace of mind and the courage to move forward in sync to really move the needle on some of the big issues. So it has been super productive. And of course, we are all very grateful as a district that in light of the more constrained budget projection that Montgomery County delegation as a whole was able to bring over $1 billion direct aid, but District 15 is able to fund, a total of 13 projects, 10 of which through bond initiatives, totaling $2 million that you have all probably read from our newsletters and so forth. There are a couple of several bills that I have not heard mentioned that I want to also make a mention because we all have limited time. And I noticed that you give the senator 3 extra minutes, so.
I'll give it to you in closing statements.
I'll go fast. One is I don't know if the senator mentioned the Fair Wage Act. He might have. That was one of the bills that the Economic Matters Committee, the delegate Fraser Hidalgo and I now serve together. We also advanced the Access to Banking Act, which is critical for small businesses, especially in underserved communities, to make sure credit unions and banks will go there and locate there. There's an also important gun safety bill and a big Child Victims Protection Act this year that finally passed after many, many years of deeply emotional struggles by many victims, including our committee chair, C.T. Wilson, that you probably have read in the news, but that was a big win. And the Maryland 529 plan, which many of us have used to fund our kids' education, is now being transitioned to a treasurer's office for greater accountability. And one of my proudest bills this session, which is also one of the big bills of this session, is the Family Medical Leave Implementation Act. We finally can start implementing it through this modification bill, because last year we passed this milestone bill, but it was only a framework without answering all the details of the cost share between employer and employee, about notification requirements and about the total rate. And now we know, when the implementation will be, when the rate will be collected, and when the benefits will be distributed, and who is responsible for notifying whom. And the cost share is 50-50 between employer and employee. And the companies, organizations that employ people under 15 do not have to pay the cost share part of the employer contribution. And sole proprietors can opt in if they want to, but there's no requirement for them to participate. And the community organizations funded by the state or counties are exempt from having to contribute the employer portion. So it's a very generous, well thought out piece of legislation that was the product of many, many different parties' contributions and business community and time to care advocacy community, as well as the insurance industry. So I'm very proud that not only we did it, but how we did it. I think that's one thing we can look back years later to say, we are very proud of how we legislate. And then there are several economic development bills, one of which is my biggest bill that I put all my political capital on, which is the Industry 4.0 matching grant program for the small, medium-sized manufacturers, because I chaired a work group for a year and a half, and this was our top priority. I asked for 10 million, I only got 1. So I was screaming at the speaker's office that you have to put it back next year, add more money, but we'll see. But I'm grateful for what we got so far. And there's Clarksburg company that converts autonomous vehicles. So my bill helped them convert more autonomous vehicles, not passenger, but industrial, commercial autonomous vehicles, and sell more out of state by exempting them from the definition of being a dealer. Those kind of weird updates of the vehicle laws, but it's, for economic development. And also another bill is to allow local production alcohol producers like breweries, wineries, distilleries, and local producers to be able to directly ship to consumers like what they could during the pandemic in order to sustain them, because they cannot compete if you stop the lifeline of that kind of delivery. And yes, as Senator Feldman mentioned, I did pass a cybersecurity critical infrastructure bill to make sure that public utilities that we rely on water and electricity infrastructure is properly protected, and there is assessment and reporting to the Public Service Commission. I have passed a couple other business licensing related bills because I happen to chair the subcommittee on business licensing. But another one that I'm proud of is to give accurate data access to Maryland State's retirement savings program, because they cannot really function properly if the state cuts off their lifeline, which is access to accurate data, in order to promote and reach the employers to encourage workers to save for their retirement. Let's see. Oh, one thing I want to mention is it's a pity. I saw some questions beforehand. Somebody asked about Empower. So I introduced about 3 clean energy bills this session, one of which is Sierra Club's one of the top priorities, which is the Empower Reform Bill. However, we kind of ran out of time on the Senate side because the House took a long time to add this and that, and it became a huge omnibus bill. By the time we finished it, there were only a couple of days left. So I understand it did not cross the finish line, but that was not because we didn't try. Everybody tried very hard. So I'm going to stop here. I probably have already overdrafted. Election, if I could borrow a minute. Election 2024 primary date has been moved to May 14th. Because of the conflict with Passover, I think. And then with another bill we passed this year, we're going to require the local county board of elections to start counting the mailing ballots 8 days ahead of early voting, so that we won't run into the same situation we went into last election. So that's it for the quick summary.
All right, thank you so much, Lily. Delegate Foley.
Hey, thank you, Saman, and thanks to my friends in the District 15 caucus, Kathy, Gail, Ginger, Larry, and everyone for hosting this and putting work into this. This is always a fun thing to do. And it's also very important, I think, for the constituents to hear what we do up there in Annapolis. So going last, I'm the new kid on the block, even though I don't look like it, I'm still the new kid on the block. Going last means that, most of the stuff has been covered, but I'm just going to cover a couple of other things that maybe my colleagues didn't mention, because we did have, as Delegate Chee said, we had an incredibly busy session, and it was hard to get all the bills through, and a lot of them didn't get through, including several of mine. I'll start by mentioning, that it continues to be a real honor and privilege to serve the residents of District 15, and it continues to be a real honor and privilege to serve on this legislative team. We do really work together as a team. We get along really well. We try to support each other as much as we can, and I think that shows in the results of the legislation that we get through. And I also want to say that it really is a pleasure to have Senator Feldman chairing a committee. It's really nice to have someone in the Senate that we can go to, and I know I went to him on one of my bills, as Delegate Frazier Hidalgo said he did, to try and get his committee to move on it, and he did. So that's very nice, and congratulations to him. And I think we're really lucky to have him there chairing a committee in the Senate. That's a really good thing for our district. So a few highlights from where I see it from the session that haven't been mentioned yet. First of all, my bills, the one bill, I passed a couple of towing bills because now I'm the queen of the towing bills. But one of them is a really important bill where we actually negotiated a truce between the towers and the truckers. We were having some trouble with supply chain issues because of the towing companies and some of their practices. And we now have that resolved. And we have set up a committee going forward so that they have to work with each other going forward in the Department of State Police. And so I'm very proud of that bill. But by far the most popular bill that I passed this session was a bill to allow local jurisdictions to adopt ordinances to control and contain or ban the sale of running invasive bamboo, which has become kind of a menace in our community. And this is a bill that came to me from a constituent. This idea came to me from a constituent, and it was a very popular bill once people saw it on the legislative calendar. And thanks to Senator Feldman's committee and the committee I serve on, Environment and Transportation, that bill is passed, and we now have a way to fight bamboo. I think that invasive bamboo, I should say. That leads me to an important area in Environment and Transportation Committee, and Delegate Frazier Hidalgo and Delegate Chee talked about some of the issues with respect to climate change that my committee also dealt with, but some other things that we dealt with in my committee had to do with forest preservation native plants. We did pass an important forest preservation bill. We passed the Maryland, the Beautiful Act, which protects 30% of Maryland's lands from development by 2030 and 40% by 2040. We also passed a Maryland Native Plants program to promote the planting and the fostering of native plants. And we beefed up the community solar pilot program a little bit. So those are just some of the other things that we did in the committee that I serve on, which is Environment and Transportation. In addition, a couple of things that my colleagues did not mention, because again, there was so much that I think are really important. One is we did pass the Trans Equity Health Bill, that while other states are attacking transgender individuals and putting up barriers to people who seek help for transgender health, we in Maryland passed a bill that allowed, that included the transgender services, health services, necessary transgender health services in our healthcare scheme. That was a very, very important bill that did not pass last year, but passed this year. We also, in addition to the reproductive package reproductive rights package that Senator Feldman worked on and talked about, we also passed some other important bills for women. One of them is we finally repealed the spousal defense for rape, which is a really, really important bill. Delegate Chi mentioned that the statute of limitation for on child abuse crimes has been lifted, and that was another really important bill that we passed. And there were many, many others that went through the legislature that, as we said, we could go on and on. Delegate Chi mentioned that we did bring $2.2 million in bond initiatives and other capital expenditures to the district. And again, working as a team, we were able to do that. Us on the House side and then Senator Feldman on the Senate side. And I just want to run through the list of the projects, not the amounts, but the list of the projects that were included in those allocations. We funded a Riverworks Arts Center in Poolsville. We funded the Up County Hub in Germantown. We funded a project at Clarksburg Yard in Clarksburg. The Ivy Mount School in Potomac got a grant. The Black Rock Center for the Arts got a grant. The Jewish Foundation for Group Homes got a grant. Potomac Community Center got a grant for a park for people with disabilities, a fitness center. Islamic Education Center got a grant to upgrade its kitchen. The Alam Academy got a grant to renovate some of the areas around its school. Muddy Branch Steam Valley Park got a grant, and the Maryland Soccer Foundation, the Soccerplex, got a grant, as well as Shirley Povich Field, which is barely inside our district, but a lot of our people in District 15 avail themselves of Shirley Povich Field. So those are just some of the projects that we were able to help by getting this money, to them in a year when, the budget was a little bit challenging. So I'm very, very proud of the session we had. I think there's more work to do. A number of my bills that I really cared about around one, particularly collective bargaining for graduate assistants and university professors, didn't move, but I'm committed to bringing that back next year and getting that done. And I'm also still fighting to ban and regulate gasoline-powered leaf blowers. I had a bill on that also stalled. But working with the county, I'm hoping to move that forward in the future. So I look forward to your questions as well. Thank you again for doing this, and back to you, Saman.
All right, great. So we're going to first begin with a set of questions. I want to thank the delegates for all of their opening remarks. I think it gives a really great stage for some of the questions that have come in from constituents. So note that the questions that I'm going to be asking have already come in for constituents when they registered for the town hall. And I think if we have time, we'll yield some additional Q&As from the floor, and Kathy's going to kind of field those questions and call upon individuals if their question hasn't been asked. So I think one of the first things that we're going to start with is the cannabis bill. Now that it has passed, what is the next step? Like, what is that looking like? Because I think there were a lot of questions going in about cannabis. There's a lot of support, obviously, for it, but like just figuring out, and perhaps Brian can touch upon this, or even Lily, but the economic side of how this is going to be licensed and available, and the industry around it. So
Sure. Well, we have to start with, we had a ballot initiative in November, and about 70% of Marylanders said, yes, we want to move forward and join 20 other states to tax and regulate and test the product that's already out there. And so we passed legislation last year dealing with some of the criminal justice reform aspects, which set a target essentially by July 1 of 2023, where we're going to be up and running with adult use product being out there. I should say the political landscape has shifted pretty dramatically over the last 10 years. About a decade ago, we were one of the first states to go with a medical cannabis legalization bill. Now there are 38 states, literally blue-red states, and we have 160,000 Marylanders who currently have been utilizing medical cannabis with their cards and such. So transitioning and also the landscape on the East Coast, we've got now New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, and so we're sort of becoming a little bit on the island, but it's, there are a lot of issues. So the way we've set this up is that by July 1st of 2023, we're going to put the infrastructure and the framework in place. And it's partly designed so that we can box out the illicit market. One of the problems in the country is states go legalization, adult use, and when I say adult use, it's only 21 and older. Okay, it's not going to be legal for anybody under that age. But the illicit market comes in and grabs the market up, and the legal market comes in later and has difficulty ever getting back in the game. So one of the challenges here is to try to get a market up and running. So the existing medical cannabis licensees that have spent millions of dollars to build up their businesses will be able to convert their medical licenses into an adult use license. And that has to be done by July 1st of 2023. And by doing it that way, and that's the way it's been done in all the other states, product will be available July 1st, 2023. So we're going to have the conversion of grower licenses, processor licenses, and dispensaries. Those folks can convert for a big fee, and a lot of that money will then get reinvested, these conversion fees, back into communities that have been disproportionately impacted by prior cannabis policies. And so that's the first leg to drop. And then subsequently, when we get to January of 2024, there will be a second round of licenses for what we would characterize as social equity applicants. So one of the goals here is box out the illicit market by getting product into the marketplace early. But then later, it's about inclusion and diversity, because one of the challenges we had with the medical program was we doled out a lot of licenses, but it turned out that almost all the early licensees were a lot of rich white folks, just for lack of a better term. And that presented itself with a lot of problems, pushback. We attempted to resolve that in 2018 with the medical licensees. So we didn't want to go down that road again. And so we are going to have a second round of licenses for social equity applicants. And then, we'll be back in 2024, potentially to make some adjustments. But these product, again, it's going to be taxed, but also tested. This isn't all about tax revenue. It's also about safety, because there's been a lot of reports about when you talk about untested product, it's you don't know what you're getting. And so this is as much about safety as revenue, and then taking the money and investing in state priorities, preferably a lot of that money going back to the locals for more law enforcement, for public health, for, again, back to communities that have been impacted disproportionately by the prior cannabis policies on law enforcement. So that's in a nutshell. So July 1, 2023 is sort of the first key date. And then January 1st of 2024 is sort of the second tranche when we throw in a lot of the applications for social equity applicants. And then there's enough in there that when we get to May of 2024, there could be a second round of licenses. And by the way, the whole regulatory framework is being moved from the Medical Cannabis Commission to a brand new entity called the Medical Cannabis Administration. And that is a newfangled entity, and they're going to have singularly have jurisdiction over both our medical cannabis industry as well as the new adult use legal market that will kick in July 1st of 2023. So hopefully that gives you kind of a basic framework about what to expect moving forward in Maryland. But it all started with the ballot initiative 70%, almost 70% of Marylanders voted yes on that ballot in November.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. So, sorry. Second question. This one is for
Just a sec,
Lily.
Salman,
Oh,
one
sure.
second.
Go ahead.
Before we move on, I just want to mention one other thing that's important, and kudos to Brian and everyone that worked on that cannabis bill. It's an incredibly complicated regime, but it's very important that we get it right. And I think, this bill seems to cover those bases, and, and as he explained, also takes care of people who are disparately impacted. And along those lines, one of the last bills we passed in the House coming over from the Senate was the bill that prohibits police search of a person or vehicle based solely on the odor of cannabis. And that's a really important bill because, police oftentimes use that to pull people over, and it disparately impacts those communities, those underserved communities that were disparately impacted by the war on drugs before. So that was an incredibly important bill that we passed at the last minute. I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Yeah. Can I add also one other thing? It's one thing to dole out licenses. It's another thing to give the folks who have the licenses the wherewithal to actually become operational. One of the problems we had with the medical program was we did issue a lot of new licenses in 2018, but not a single one of those licensees are actually operational today in 2023. And so one of the other, I think, important parts of the legislation is there's a cannabis assistance fund. It provides capital, access to capital for these new licensees to make it work. And so that was another big part of the equation here is licenses are one thing, but giving folks access to capital so they can actually make a go of it and become operational is an equally, it's a big challenge. And I think we've put in place a number of provisions and funds to actually increase the likelihood that that will actually happen.
Right. And I really appreciate, Linda, you chiming in on that, because it's the fact that, when we're talking about cannabis bill and reform, we have to look at it from such a multifaceted lens of the variety of different ways that communities have been marginalized or at risk. And so if anyone else wants to chime in, feel free to do so at any of the questions. I'm kind of just based upon the conversations and the topics that you guys have mentioned, I'm fielding questions your way. So the next one goes to Lily. The legislator passed a bill to expedite the implementation of the $15 minimum wage act, but failed to tie the future increases to the inflation, the CPI, as requested by the governor, and which is already in effect for Montgomery County. So corporate profits are said to be at an all-time high. So do you support the passing of this legislation next year to ensure that minimum wage keeps pace with inflation and no one works full-time and lives in poverty in our state? So basically tying the minimum wage rate with the CPI.
Yeah. Well, so I think if I recall correctly, this year, the Senate side took the lead in working out the details of the governor's bill, one of the top 10 governor's priority bills. Then the House would, vote on the Senate bill because we were the corresponding committee for that bill. And I think the thinking, just like when in 2019, my first session, we passed the minimum wage bill, right? There was a lot of outcry that we did not put in CPI. But at that time, the feeling is probably the same as this time, which is, a few months later, we'll be back in session again and to look at the impact of what this Fair Wage Act is doing to the workers and their employers. Yes, I agree. There are a lot of big corporations that is flush with cash, but there are also a lot of struggling small businesses that need the time to budget and adjust. When we just put more burden on them by passing this cost share 50-50 of mandated, you cannot opt out if you do business in Maryland, right? If you hire 15 employees or more, you must pay 50% of the cost share. And then on top of that, we ask you to accelerate the minimum wage by 2 years. People need time to adjust. Not every little small business is able to quickly adapt on top of another. So we need to be realistic how much we do in one sitting. This is not an academic exercise. It's people, working people who need to make the paycheck and sign in the front of the check. And we are very mindful how many of these bills we pass and what is the data-driven facts that we have to act on, because sometimes we legislators can go in with the deep passion, but we have to be fact-based and data-driven in how we do these things. And we come back every year to see if it's working and how well it's working and what we need to do to tweak. So yes, in theory, we all support adjusting minimum wage, but everything we do have unintended consequences. So which is how I'm going to respond to this question.
And Saman, if I may follow up just briefly, the other part about this is that I know that there were conversations in both finance and in ECM, and that is that we find ourselves in an economy that is coming out of a pandemic, and an economy that still has supply chain issues, and an economy that still has chip shortages. And I think that there is some concern as to whether we are on a quick road to a recession of some kind and what that looks like, whether that's just in this country or whether that's a worldwide recession. There's also more conversation than ever on the House floor on what's going on globally when it comes to Ukraine and Russia and China and Taiwan. So you put all those things together, and I think the thought was to just kind of put it off and have another conversation in a year.
Yeah, I would just like to add someone from one thing to what my colleagues have said, which is that I am, though, very happy that and pleased that we have a governor in administration, the Moore-Miller administration, and I know that the second gentleman, Dave Miller, is on this call, and it is really a partnership, the Moore-Miller administration, and we shouldn't forget that Aruna Miller is a favorite daughter of District 15. She was a delegate from District 15, and she's now in the lieutenant governor's seat. But it's really a pleasure that we have a governor who thinks about things like this and is trying to promote policies like this. So I'm confident that in the future, our minimum wage will keep up with, and we'll continue to try to help Maryland workers by raising the minimum wage and being mindful of the effect that it has, as Delegate Chee said, on our small business community.
Thank you. And Lily, I really appreciate you drawing the distinction between corporate profits of major corporations and Fortune 500. And the story of those that are on Main Street is very different. And
99% of businesses.
Exactly. And so I think that's really a tremendous thing. Even the ones that are franchised, it's really day-to-day operations and bottom lines. But at least we're moving in the right direction. So Linda, I know you mentioned, and maybe this is the same bill, but what happened with the HB 65, which is the collective bargaining for Maryland library workers? Is that something that's similar to the one to give collective bargaining rights to the graduate assistants?
Right. They were two different bills, but, if I would say there was one area from my perspective, because as people know, I come from a union perspective. So the right to collective bargaining is very important to me as a policymaker. And I think the one area where I was a little disappointed in this legislature was that we didn't move enough collective bargaining bills. There were several of them out there. And the libraries bill also got hung up as well. It moved a little more. I think it moved out of the House, but got hung up in the Senate in the Judicial Proceedings Committee. So that's an area overall that I would like to see us do better in. The bill that I had was cross-filed by Senator Kramer in the Senate, and that was a bill, and I think Brian was a co-sponsor of that bill. That was a bill to allow the graduate assistants at the University of Maryland and the professors at the University of Maryland to have right to collective bargaining. In Maryland, we have to do this piecemeal, piece by piece, because that's just the way, because we have charter counties and charter jurisdictions. But I'm hoping next session we make a little more progress in that area. But yeah, that bill also stalled, unfortunately. And really, none of the collective bargaining bills, I don't think, really made it through this time. We did make some improvements in worker rights with respect to the labor board and some other things, but not really in the area of collective bargaining.
All right, thank you, Linda. So I want to pivot to another issue on education. This is for Senator Feldman. Why did the burden of proof bill not move out of I call it the 3E committee, but I guess triple E is the appropriate name, as it affects, kids with special needs and their families?
Yeah, well, let me, because I think let me give a little more context because you wouldn't know it from some of the talking points that I saw on the social media. But first of all, as far as, interest in, I was the keynote speaker this, along with Governor Moore, on DDA Day in Annapolis. And one of the reasons I've been asked to do this last couple of years is some of the bills that have been most important to kids with various disabilities have been bills that I've sponsored. So a few years ago, one of the bills I'm most proud of is the ABLE Act, which allows parents with kids with disabilities to actually save for their children's future with tax deferred accounts similar to 529 plans. So the ABLE account program in Maryland was a bill of mine. So I only make that point because this is a bit of a tough issue. We had multiple bills in dealing with special ed. And among other things, we had the governor's bill dealing with the Educator Shortage Act. And what that piece of legislation, which we did pass, highlighted was the one area that the shortage is most pronounced is special ed. Okay, so we had multiple bills. We had Aaron Kaufman, one of our newest delegate, had a bill dealing with attorney's fees that would reward parents, and this came to my committee, that if you go through the process of challenging the so-called IEP process, the plan that's put in place by the school system for your child who may have a disability of some sort, you can challenge that. And there's a long process. You can go through mediation. At the end of it all, you can file a due process complaint. And that's basically an adversarial process. And in the state of Maryland, the last couple of years, there's only been about 200 or 300 of those cases. So this bill, I don't mean to be long-winded, but this is really important that I kind of lay this out. And so there's different parts along the continuum before you get to at the end, the due process complaint issue. The issue that you're alluding to is who bears the burden of proof when you get to the end of the process. And this goes back to a Supreme Court case that came out of Montgomery County many years ago, involving then Superintendent Jerry Wiest. The case was called Schaefer v. Wiest, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 2005, and it dealt with this very issue of burden of proof. And the court in that case said the burden of proof shall lie with the party that is aggrieved and seeking relief. Okay, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court had said. And since that time, a lot of states have dealt with this issue. The vast majority of states have not put the burden of proof on the school system, as was what this bill asked to do. There's about 6 or 7 states have done that. The vast majority have not. But let me just piece this all together and kind of get to the end of it. So the attorney's fees issue, because this is about access, I think the argument, and it's a reasonable one, is if the burden of proof lies with the parents, they're going to be outgunned. You got to go have lawyers. It's expensive. And when you get to the end of the process, it's David versus Goliath kind of an argument, which I think is reasonable. But so we try to do 3 other things. Number one, the attorney's fees bill that Aaron Kaufman put in came to my committee. We did pass that. So when you hire expert witnesses and you ultimately prevail, you will be able to recover your attorney's fees. We also put in place, we were able to get funding for the very first time for something called an ombudsman for these kind of cases. So we created it 2 years ago, but Governor Hogan did not fund it. We were able to get into the budget funding for an ombudsman within the Attorney General's office to help guide parents through the process, through the early stages, through the mediation process, to help sort of address this. And then Chair Atterbury in the House and I are working on a financial assistance package for the parents to, again, help sort of bridge this gap, if you will. But at the end of the day, in the states that have shifted the burden of proof to the boards of education, in none of those states, including New Jersey, most recently, those 6 or 7 states that, not the majority, which is where Maryland is, they have not seen any increase in the number of actual cases. So if the argument is access, then the case hasn't necessarily been made in the 6 or 7 states that would do what this bill called for, was shifting the burden of proof to the school system. And I just would say on the governor's bill, we had educators come in and say that if the burden of proof is shifted, they'd be spending more of their time doing paperwork, preparing for litigation, than actually teaching these children. And so we put this all together, and there was, I would say in the committee, there was a split, and we kind of ran a little bit out of time in terms of a consensus on how to deal with that one bill from Vanessa Atterbury, we did put these other 3 provisions in place, specifically attorney's fees and funding for the ombudsman. And I think when we get back to 2024, we're going to take a fresh look at the burden of proof issue, which I think is a real one. There was actually a 32-page report done by the General Assembly 2 years ago on this very specific topic. And we've had bills on the burden of proof since 2013, which have not passed. And it's partly because these issues are a little bit more complicated than you would have it, I believe, if you read just some of the talking points about the burden of proof. So it's a complicated issue. I think it's a legit issue, a legit debate. Most of the states are where Maryland is currently. We put some things in place, I think, that'll be helpful for parents. But, and again, we have a 32-page report that outlines some of the policy challenges. And then we also, again, have this topic of special ed teachers, already have a shortage of them, and to put additional burdens on them for purposes of possible litigation down the road was another thing that the committee grappled with. And ultimately, we didn't end up passing it, but I think we're going to revisit it in the 2024 session. I know that was really long-winded, but this is, was a very hot topic, very difficult topic for the committee to deal with. So I'll yield back, and I'll go more if people want to hear a little more. That was just kind of some of the sort of broad sort of outlines, some of the issues we had to deal with on that particular piece of legislation.
No, we really appreciate that. So, another really big, there was a lot of conversation, obviously, we know after the Dodge decision at the Supreme Court. So for reproductive rights and really to protect those, what are the next steps now that some of these bills have passed through the Maryland General Assembly?
I could say I had one of the, okay. I'll let somebody else. I had one of the bills. I mean, we're going to have another ballot initiative 2024 to enshrine some of those rights in our Constitution, dealing with abortion, contraception, fertility treatment. That will be on the ballot in 2024. That would put that in the Constitution. We also had a bill dealing with would prohibit Maryland from aiding other states in investigating criminal investigations in court proceedings against patients and providers, patients who came to our state. Our state's not going to cooperate with these other states trying to do investigations of folks who came to our state for reproductive health services. And then also patient records. We had a third piece of legislation that prohibited patient records about reproductive health care access to cross state lines and send them back to wherever the patient came from. So we're not going to play ball with those states. They're going in a completely different direction. That basically are the other 3 bills in addition to the higher ed bill that I introduced dealing with reproductive health services plans on our campuses. So those are the sort of package of 4 bills.
Does anyone want to chime in on that?
Well, I'll just say that
with
these, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lily. I'm sorry.
No, I said the senator pretty much covered.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Maryland now is a state that's positioned to really be a sanctuary state for abortion care. We are going to be a place where people can come and they can get the reproductive care that they need.
All right. So moving on to gun safety. I know we have passed a few bills this session as well. What more can we do to establish gun safety laws in our state, and how does our state kind of hold up to some of the other jurisdictions around the country, and how aggressive we're being on that?
The reproductive rights?
No, we're on gun safety now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Guns.
Oh, guns. Okay.
I'll jump in and say that sometimes I think that, and this is probably not going to be a really popular thing to say, but I think it's coming anyway, so it is what it is. Sometimes we pass bills that sound really great and they don't really do what we think that they're going to do. And so this, would you say, Lily?
Oh, much at all.
Or much at all. And in this particular case, we passed a bill called Senate Bill 1, which I guess it helps. I think a lot of people that may or may not understand how carry permits work. And as former law enforcement, I know what it's like to carry a firearm, and I know what it's like to carry a firearm in plain clothes. And so I'm not really quite sure. I'm not really quite sure how this
Senate Bill 1 was
Senate Bill 1.
Senate Bill 1, it's the one that was introduced by Jeff Waldstreicher, right?
Yeah,
No.
yeah. I mean, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
there's a lot of good intentions to it, but I'm
Yeah.
concerned, and I remain concerned that it can yield a lot of confusion and could yield some bad results. But you know, not everybody has a crystal ball, so I'm happy to talk into that in more detail if anybody wants to. But I mean, we passed it, and hopefully it makes things better.
Well, Salman, it should be said that we didn't have any choice, though, because the Supreme Court weighed in this space in a New York case. And it basically, under that case, our laws on concealed weapon permits was basically not constitutional. And so we really were left with no choice to go back and try to craft something, understanding where this conservative Supreme Court is on the topic. And, you know, as Dave pointed out, we don't know if it'll actually achieve what it intended, but we couldn't leave an unconstitutional law on the book. So you're right, Senator Waldstreicher, you know, did put in a bill that dealt with where you could, under what circumstances could you have a concealed weapon, and where can you take the concealed weapon. We don't want them in, you know, various places, schools, polling places, bars, places where alcohol or cannabis are. So that is the intent of this bill, that we think will meet the constitutional muster under the Supreme Court case that basically was a death blow to our legislation. And then the other bill, I think it's referenced here in the chat line, Jalen's law dealing with safe storage of firearms, which was, I believe, Senator Smith's bill, keeping away from children and other people who are prohibited from possessing guns, and then increases penalties. So those are the two big bills. But the SB1, we really had to do something to get our, you know, unconstitutional law off the books and come up with something that potentially does some good. So,
and I wouldn't be surprised if SB1 goes directly back to the Supreme Court again.
Right. It's highly likely to be challenged again. There's no doubt about it. In fact, we spent a huge amount of time on the floor, and I think on the House as well, talking about, is this going to be another bill that we pass that ends up getting struck down by the courts? You know, can't predict that, but we couldn't stand pat, I guess, is the point here.
Right.
You know, as much as all of us are deeply frustrated with gun violence, we also have to understand Maryland is already among the top states in the country in terms of having very strict gun laws. Oftentimes, the guns we found in violent crimes came from illegal market, and some of them from Virginia, for example, right? So we could do all we can, and this is such a fluid market, you know, and it is true to some extent that criminals don't listen to our laws. And it's also hard to enforce sometimes. So it's a combination of many factors. On that front, you know, America is guilty as charged in terms of having more guns than people, and all of those ills that we need to address. So Maryland is pulling our weight, I have to say, you know.
Yeah, and I'd also
kind
add
of
that
goes back. Oh,
yeah, it wasn't until the Supreme Court stepped in 2013, and this was former delegate, now Judge Dumais, was sort of spearheaded. We passed under former Governor O'Malley, really literally some of the strongest gun safety laws in the United States of America. And they really stood the test of time until we got to the Supreme Court case in Bruin. But former Delegate Dumais was like the floor leader, front person on all those gun safety laws from the O'Malley era. So I want to give her a shout out and abstention here.
Well, if she's here, then special shout out to her. No, to Lily's point, you know, I think that's one of the really crucial things, because we did the ghost guns law. I believe you all did that in the last session. And one of the biggest problems is the issue of interstate commerce and crossing over from state lines. And that's not something we can regulate. And the jurisdictions are, they can be red or you can call it purple. And we're sandwiched between Pennsylvania and Virginia, you know, very different views on those. So let's pivot to another issue, and that's environment. So I think, you know, with the aggressive Moore Miller agenda, you know, we're very serious about climate change and environment. And so we got a question from Mark Mayerovich. Maryland wants to be California #2 by following the same environmental and health policies. What real data from California show benefits of such policies? David?
Sure, I can take it. I don't have data directly in front of me. If you want to have an offline conversation about it, but hey, you know, often is said in committee, particularly in ENT and in ECM and economic matters, but a lot in environment and transportation, is why do we always want to follow California? What does California do right? And it's so funny when we get that, because we got it. We would get it on a fairly regular basis. And one time I had kind of had enough of that question. So I looked at the Republican members in the committee and I said, do you realize that California is the sixth largest economy? Not the sixth largest economy in the United States, mind you, the sixth largest economy in the world. So if you want to keep talking about jobs, like, maybe this is a good place to go. So, Tesla has a big manufacturing plant in Fremont. There are a lot of electric cars, more electric cars made in California currently than anywhere else in the country. There are some that are going to be made in Texas and other areas, but that is as far as pushing forward. I don't know if the specific question is on the clean trucks rule, but California often passes things and we follow. We in 2007 entered into a kind of a joint relationship with California and 9 other states called the Zero Emission Electric Vehicle Committee or Commission. And that commission means that we are on par. We have goals to meet emission standards when it comes to specifically electric vehicle production. In Maryland, that's 200,000 vehicles by 2025, I think, and then more and more and more. And in this past session, I think a year ago or so, we did some, California did, 2 years ago, California did it, where the governor of California said that he wanted all vehicles in California that are sold in California, I think by 2035 to be zero emission vehicles, not necessarily including trucks and medium weight vehicles like Class 8 trucks. And then last year, their legislature actually passed it. So, and this year, the Moore administration, in their wisdom, the Hogan administration refused to do it, but the Moore administration enacted all the regulations necessary for us to do the same thing with clean vehicles in the state of Maryland. So zero emission by 2035, which is a huge win for us and for the state. And for trucks, I think it's important to realize that is next. Like, cars are coming very, very fast. There are currently probably over a dozen cars that are electric that are available for purchase. And inside of a year, there'll probably be 30 of them. So it's going to get there. For those people that think that that's too soon, I will tell you, if there is a car manufacturer in this world that does not have a majority of their cars offered electric by 2030 or 2027, they are in very big trouble. Already, you can make the argument that Ford and General Motors are in really big trouble. So is Toyota and Honda in various degrees. And I can go into as much detail as anybody wants because I get pretty geeky on it. But so as far as reaching that by 2035, I'm not worried about it at all, because if you're a car manufacturer and you don't have most of your cars manufactured, most of your offering that are electric by 2027 or 2028, you're going to be out of business very shortly thereafter. As far as trucks are concerned, that's the same thing. Trucks are a few years behind cars, but Volvo has a plant in Hagerstown where they're now producing electric trucks, electric semis. Just a few years ago, it was a Mack factory. Volvo bought them, so it's a Mack/Volvo factory. And they were producing drivetrains, engines and transmissions. I visited the place. It was pretty cool. Now they're doing, electric motors and electric motors and gears that have to do with big trucks. And they're producing semis that have a 200-mile range. Tesla is producing semis that have a 500-mile range. So I don't think it's a big concern. If there is, I think we're going to get there, and we're going to get there a lot faster than most people realize.
And can I just add one other thing? The reason this ties into climate change is the biggest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is the transportation sector.
33%.
Correct. So you can't really deal with climate change, and that's why we're moving towards the California emission standards. That's why the country is moving towards zero emission vehicles, is because of that factoid. So if you're looking for statistics, that's really kind of the threshold fact that everybody needs to know. The transportation sector, whether it's 33% or 40% of greenhouse gas emission, come from the vehicles. And so that's why we're adopting California.
Right. And the other reason we adopt California is historical in some sense, because California has led the way on emissions, regulating emissions. And because they are so large as an economy, as Delegate Fraser-Doggo pointed out, they actually have, for many years had their own emission standards. I think they still do. That sort of set the standard for the rest of the country. The rest of the country's behind them. So if we want to stay ahead of this curve, we need to stay with where they're going from everything that's been said here.
And can I tell one of my bills, Saman, before we go to the next question?
Absolutely.
Which is why it used to be range anxiety was the biggest reason people didn't buy electric vehicles, but now it's charging infrastructure anxiety. And therefore I had legislation which passed, which came through the Environment and Transportation Committee, that starting next year, every new home built in Maryland,
Right.
single family townhouse with a garage, carport, or driveway will be required to be built with a at least one EV ready space. And so that's piece of legislation that I introduced, which passed, came through Linda's committee. It was not easy. But at the end of the day, the builders and the developers supported the bill. Why? Because they see where things are moving. And
Right.
so that's the future. Again, electric vehicle infrastructure is also part of this. It's one thing to have cars on the lot, but it's another thing for people to buy them and then have the infrastructure in place to charge those cars. And why that's so important, 80 to 90% of EV users charge their cars at home, and that's where they need it most.
And I
Well, I
will
just
say,
got done
Saman,
paying for my bill.
you know,
to
I
get
will
it charged
say,
and for it installed.
I will say, Saman, that we talked about how quickly things can move and how slowly things can move. This is an example of how quickly, because when I was on ENT the previous 2 years, we had a version of this bill that could not get out. It could not get out of committee, to the point where I went head to head with the builders, because the builders claimed it was going to cost thousands of dollars. And I'm like, all you're doing is running an electrical line, the equivalent of a dryer load, to someone's garage. Don't tell me this is going to cost thousands of dollars. It's a dryer outlet. That's all it is. And 2 years later or a year later, they're supporting it. I mean, it's crazy. But that's what
The next challenge in that area, and you know, Delegate Frazier-Doggo and Senator Feldman are right. This is a very important bill, but the next challenge is for multifamily homes, because if you live in an apartment or a condominium, it's a whole other set of issues in terms of trying, and that, you know, that we have to work on that, because that, I think, am I right, Senator Feldman, that did not get through on this bill, right?
Yeah, that issue, we asked the Maryland Energy Administration to do a study on that very topic, and that's important. Although I will say, Delegate Frazier-Doggo's bill on electric vehicle reliability and the pilot program currently in place for public chargers, under that bill, it's going to authorize electric companies to go into multifamily dwelling spaces. So that is part of the what we did achieve. But you're right, we punted to the MEA to come back with some recommendations on how to deal with the more complicated issue of the multi-dwelling. That is a little more complicated than single family homes.
So I think what you're hearing, Saman, is that they punted to the MEA for that part. And in my bill, we just went ahead and did it.
That's great too.
Well, it
with that
wasn't,
said, on
it
a high
wasn't
note-
Senator Feldman's bill to begin with, but it got taken out, so.
No, but Senator Feldman helped me pass that bill. That went to Senator Feldman's committee, and Senator Feldman helped me get that bill, because that was controversial to have the public utilities like Pepco and BG&E go into multifamily dwelling units and put in chargers when private companies don't want to, because they don't see the economic advantage. But
Correct.
to allow our utilities to go in there is a big step. So a big thank you to Brian. He knows about it because he had to argue it on the floor, and he had to convince his members to get it out when we got it over there. Another big thank you to Senator Feldman.
Thank you. All right. So on this high note, what we're going to do is, so Kathy, we'll open the floor to 2 or 3 Q&A just as a time check. It is 8:12, and we want to wrap up before 8:30, hopefully. That way we'll also pivot to any closing remarks if you guys want to give any, and then any announcements from Kathy of what's coming up and what to look forward to for D15. So Kathy, do you have any questions in the chat that you want to recognize people?
From Carl Van Nest has a question relating to guns across the state lines.
All right. So the question is, what laws are in place about carrying guns across state lines? If one is used in a felony-like crime in Maryland and the gun came from Maryland, is it a federal crime?
I don't know.
On top of my
That would be a crime in that state.
Yeah, I mean, we have, it's a little out of my lane, to be perfectly candid, but even as a former Justice Department lawyer, that's what I used to do. The gun issue in terms of federal law is still weak. And, that's why states are in these little silos doing what we can. But our ability, particularly with new case law and evolving around the country, our ability to keep guns out coming from others, it's still a challenge. But I'm not the expert on this, candidly, to be honest.
It's
All right.
illegal anytime to transport a firearm across the state line, basically.
I'm not
So-
100% sure if that's
Yeah,
right,
Yeah.
because
That's
if you
what
have
I'm
a carry
reading.
permit, if you have a
right.
concealed carry permit in Maryland and you want to go to Virginia and you have a concealed carry permit in Virginia, you can do that. Is my understanding. Again, I would also say the same thing, the caveat that Brian just gave. We're not on none of us are on the committee of jurisdiction for that, but that's my understanding. And also, if you want to transport a firearm from state to state and it's unloaded for purposes of like going to get it, I don't know, gunsmithed or something, I think you can do that as well. You can transport it. So I don't know if that's an issue, but if you're committing a felony, then I would imagine you'd be charged with said felony in that state. So if you were a Marylander and you went to Virginia and committed a felony, you'd be charged with that felony in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
All
Yeah,
right, so-
I think what Lily put in the chat is right. You can do it if you,
If you're properly stored
properly
in
stored,
some
yeah.
kind of container or whatever, yeah.
Right, and not loaded.
right.
Right, yeah.
So, Kathy, you have another question in the chat?
Sorry. From Rochelle, she's asking, what are the options to fund Metro in fiscal year 24?
That's a great question for Delegate Corman. He is the Metro King. That guy knows everything there is to know about Metro funding.
Well, one thing I will, back 3 years ago, Delegate Corman and I sponsored something called the Metro Funding Act, which for the first time in our history of our Metro system, we actually have a dedicated funding stream that goes to Maryland to fund Metro. The problem with funding for Metro, there's two things. Anything we do on the funding side has to also be signed off with identical pieces of legislation in Virginia and District of Columbia. And so we're part of a 3 jurisdiction compact. And in fact, Mark and Delegate Corman and I, for that bill I just alluded to, had to spend a lot of time with our Northern Virginia legislators. Now, at that time, we had a different governor. I think the change administration in Virginia, now they have elections coming up next year. Northern Virginia's juice level is not what it was 3 years ago when we passed that bill. And so I think any kind of a change to funding for the Metro system is going to run into problems in the Virginia side because we can't do it alone. That's number one. I will say that Paul Wiedefeld, who was the WMATA Metro manager, is our new Maryland Department of Transportation secretary. Governor Moore, I'm on the committee that actually confirms him. And I asked him this very question about the future of Metro and what are the challenges. And he did give a long answer. A lot of it's about the federal workforce has not come back in terms of coming 5 days a week back down to DC. So we have a longer term challenge with Metro and Metro funding, but unless we have a partner with either in the federal government or on the Virginia side, this is going to continue to be a big problem. So that's kind of a big non-answer, but that's sort of the best I can offer right now.
All right. So I know Ginger has the question in the chat, but I think we already answered that for the Fair Minimum Wage Act, which is at $15 an hour right now, which I think Lily answered.
About fair work. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. So is this a different one?
This
Okay, so the
delegate-
question is Delegate Foley's bill on fair work hours is a complement to fair minimum wage. I'm sorry, I misread that. Without fair hours, you can't have a living wage. Given the governor's goal to end child poverty, what are the chances for this bill to pass next year? This is going to be the last question before we go into closing remarks.
I can answer that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So Ginger's referring to the Fair Scheduling Act, which was filed by myself and co-filed by Senator Benson in the Senate. It's actually Senator Benson's bill. And I was the co-filer in the House. That bill is a bill about notice for schedule changes so that workers can adjust their personal life in a fair manner. Unfortunately, this is the second year I put this bill in, and Senator Benson's been putting it in much longer than that. Unfortunately, it has no traction. I don't know, the prospects for it passing next year, I don't think are much better. I think it's just, I just don't think that it's in the cards for this bill to pass. It's just not getting any traction in any of the committees that it's assigned to, either in the House or the Senate. So I'm stepping back and reassessing it. I think it's an important issue, but maybe there are other ways we can address it, or maybe we can do something in some other legislation. I'm just not sure about this bill because it seems to be dead on arrival now, several years in a row, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda. So let's do closing remarks. Senator Feldman, 1 minute.
Yeah, all I'd say is we've had a great partnership, the four of us, this past session, collaboration, and it's great to have on the second floor with Governor Moore and Lieutenant Governor Miller, a partner on the second floor for the first time in many, many years. And so bottom line is, I would say the sky's the limit this term, and I will just stop with that statement.
Oh, thank you. David?
You seem so surprised.
David just said that.
No, I would say the same thing that Senator Feldman said. A big thank you. I will say, as the chair of the Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus, as well as what I do as a delegate, there has been almost a post-traumatic stress disorder when it comes to working with the second floor over the last 8 years. So it was absolutely incredible to go into this session and working with the second floor and a lot of the departments and realizing that we actually had a partner to work with. A big shout out. I have actually had several conversations with the Lieutenant Governor on things that are important to District 15. Some of those conversations were had at 11 or 11:30 at night. For those that don't know, the Lieutenant Governor is a night owl, and I love it because sometimes when things hit my mind, she's like, "That's your call." So the partnerships are incredible, and I think it's important for everybody on this call to know that what we do in the Maryland General Assembly is a team sport. Nothing is done by yourself. We pass all these bills as a team. We now have a big team player, on the second floor, which is amazing. Like one of the bills that I worked on, the storage bill, that was actually in collaboration with Delegate Mark Gorman. The clean trucks bill that we talked about earlier that was asked, that was actually by Delegate Sarah Love. So everything you see before you, none of it's mine. It's all ours. And so a big thank you to everybody that helps.
All right, Lily.
Thank you so much, Sama, and thank you to all the advocates and the neighbors. I have, as I said at the beginning, I'm thrilled at the outcome of this session, both collectively and as as a returning member, second term legislator. I think what makes us effective, and I'm also speaking on this subject in response to one of the questions asked, which is, where do we get ideas for our bills? So what are the sources of our bills, right? And it's really a variety of sources. It's from our personal study and the readings, of the issues. And we say, why can't Maryland do this too, right? And our lived experiences a lot of times, or what drove us to run for office in the first place, which is you have the fire in the belly to make a difference. You're not satisfied with the status quo, and you think you can represent certain voices. And then, in our case, it's because we have a very active constituency that are well-informed and well-connected. And they want us to make sure Maryland is leading the country on many fronts. And so we get many ideas from our constituents, writing letters and emails, what have you. So this is really a point of pride, and it's an honor to serve such an amazing community. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Linda Foley.
Thank you, Saman, and just add my thank you to everybody being here, District 15 Caucus organizing this, MCDCC organizing this, and you, Saman, for doing such a great job moderating this. I just put in the chat a link to the 90-day report that the Speaker's Office puts out. Actually, the Department of Legislative Services, it's not just the Speaker's Office, which if you're interested to go into more detail about what we passed in this session, I recommend that report to you. Echoing, just picking up on what Lily said, it's really an honor and a privilege to serve this district and to serve in the Maryland General Assembly. If we were in another state or we were in the US Congress, we wouldn't be able to do the kinds of things that we do. And so I'm very proud and happy to be able to serve and to really make a difference in people's lives. I think, you know, when you hear us talk about the legislation that we passed, this is legislation that's very impactful. We're able to do that here in Maryland. We're able to do that here in Maryland because of all of you. So please stay in touch with us. And all of us put out newsletters, read our newsletters, let us hear from you, keep those cards, letters, and emails coming. You know, together we'll move forward. We'll continue to move forward. And with this administration, I think, you know, that we really are positioned to do some really big things here in Maryland and really improve our state and really make our state even greater than it already is. So thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Kathy, I just want to turn it over to you. Do you have any announcements for any events coming up in the district that our members should be aware of?
So I just want to give a shout out to our precinct chairs. They are really hardworking and they are the voices from Clarksburg to Gaithersburg to Germantown to Potomac. We really need your voice. We have events coming up on April 23rd. Trone will be in Gaithersburg. At Griffith Park at 2 o'clock. So hopefully you can come to that. And then for us, you know, if you are part of precinct officials or if you want to join us, we're going to be meeting on May 7th at Locals. We are going to have an event at the Hub coming up May 12th. That's food dispensary that we're going to get involved in. We also are going to, our precinct officials are going to make a trip to Annapolis to visit Aruna on May 18th. So we've got lots of things that we are excited about doing and join our team. You know, just I will be following up an email to you, you know, come join our team so you can get involved with all these things.
All right. And I also want to take a moment to recognize Margie DeLau, who just got confirmed by the Senate to serve on the Montgomery County Board of Elections as well. She's a precinct official of ours, so we'll be sorry to see her go, but we hope that she's going to keep up the continued good work on the Board of Elections. We know that's really, really important. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I believe it's the end of the evening and it's 8:26. So we finished with 4 minutes to spare. I guess I couldn't be held to the half hour to spare, but 4 minutes to spare. So we have a good event. Keep in touch and hopefully we'll see everyone either at the Trone event or at the Locals. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Great job, Summer.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.